Wren Hollis pressed her thumb against the cracked leather tongue of the boot and felt the laces tighten under her fingers, testing for slack the way some people might check a locked door before bed. The boot sat on the narrow windowsill of her room above the cider house, silhouetted against the last blue light of evening, and it had been there every night for the past 3 weeks, since Idris Zane had offered her a place to stay and work through the harvest season. She pulled her hand back and sat on the edge of her cot, green fingers curling into the rough wool blanket, and told herself it was sensible to keep ready, practical even. Nothing more than a habit left over from a childhood spent moving between towns that smiled at first and soured later. The orchard stretched out below her window in neat rows that followed the gentle slope of the valley. Apple trees heavy with fruit that would need picking within the week. Idris had shown her the layout on her first morning, walking the lanes between the trees with his hands in his pockets and his voice calm as he explained which varieties ripened first, which needed careful handling, which bruised if you so much as looked at them wrong. He was a man somewhere past 30, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a build that spoke of years working the land. Not tall but solid, and he had not flinched when she arrived at his gate with her pack and her resume of short-term labor positions. He had read the list of farms and orchards she had worked, all of them for a season or less, and he had nodded once and said he needed someone who knew fruit and did not mind hard work. She did not correct him when he assumed she left those positions by choice. Wren rose from the cot and moved to the wash basin, splashing her face with water that still held the afternoon warmth. Her reflection wavered in the tin mirror nailed to the wall, green skin pale in the dim light, tusks small and smooth where they curved up from her lower jaw, ears pointed and pressing back against the dark braid that hung over one shoulder. She was not large for an orc woman, built lean and strong from years of manual labor, and she had learned early to keep her head down and her voice quiet, and her belongings packed light. The room Idris had given her was sparse but clean, with a cot and a chair and a small table beneath the window, and it was more space than she had been offered at most of the places she had worked. That alone should have been enough to ease the knot that lived permanent in her chest, but she had learned not to trust kindness that came without a price attached. She dried her face and lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin, even though the night was warm. Through the open window she could hear the wind moving through the orchard and the distant sound of the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Idris's land. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did in new places, and when it finally arrived it was thin and full of dreams about packing in the dark. Morning broke clear and gold over the valley, and Wren was awake before the sun cleared the hills. She dressed in the sturdy canvas trousers and linen shirt Idris had provided, clothing meant for orchard work and free of the patches and repairs that marked her own spare set, and she laced her working boots with the same careful attention she gave the escape boot each night. By the time she made her way down the narrow stairs from her room, the kitchen in the main house was already warm with the smell of bread and coffee. Idris stood at the stove, cracking eggs into a skillet with one hand while he turned bacon with the other. He glanced up when she entered and nodded toward the table. "Morning. Coffee is fresh if you want it." Wren poured herself a cup and sat, cradling the warmth between her palms. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large room with windows that looked out over the orchard and a table scarred from years of use. Everything in it was worn but well kept, from the cast iron pans hanging on the wall to the stone sink with its hand pump. It was the kitchen of a man who lived alone but had not given up on the small rituals of care. "We will start with the early Jonathans today," Idris said, sliding eggs and bacon onto 2 plates and bringing them to the table. "The weather is holding, but I want them in before the end of the week. I will work the north section and you take the south. The crates are already staged." Wren ate quickly, unused to sitting for meals, and when she stood to carry her plate to the sink, Idris waved her off. "I will get it. Go on and start if you like. I will be out in a few minutes." She hesitated, then nodded and slipped out through the kitchen door into the cool morning air. The orchard was coming alive with birdsong, and the first bees beginning their rounds, and she walked the lane to the south section with her hands loose at her sides, breathing in the scent of ripe apples and grass. The work was familiar and soothing, the rhythm of reaching and twisting and placing each apple gently in the crate, and by the time Idris appeared on the far side of the row, she had filled 2 crates and started a third. They worked in silence through the morning, crossing paths occasionally as they moved between the trees, and when the sun was high, Idris called a break, and they sat in the shade with water and the heel of the morning's bread. He did not ask her questions about where she came from or why she had left her last position, and she was grateful for it. Most employers wanted a story, some justification for hiring an orc when there were human workers available, and she had learned to give them enough truth to satisfy without revealing the pattern of suspicion and accusation that followed her from place to place. "You have a good hand for the fruit," Idris said, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "No bruising. That matters more than speed." "I have picked enough apples to know how they like to be handled," Wren said. He smiled faintly and stood brushing crumbs from his trousers. "Then we should get on well. The cider press will need running in a few weeks, and the storage cellar will need organizing before winter. If you are willing to stay past harvest, there is work enough to keep you through to spring." Wren felt the knot in her chest tighten, a reflex born of too many offers that came with conditions unspoken. "I will think on it. Fair enough." Idris gathered the water jug and the empty bread cloth and started back toward the house. "Take your time with the next row. I want quality over speed." She watched him go, tall and steady in the dappled light, and then returned to her work. The afternoon passed in the same quiet rhythm, and by the time the sun was sinking behind the western hills, she had filled 12 crates and her shoulders ached in the good way that came from honest labor. She carried the last crate to the collection point near the barn and found Idris there already, tallying the day's haul in a worn ledger. "Good work," he said without looking up. "Dinner will be ready in an hour if you want to wash up." Wren climbed the stairs to her room and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the boot on the windowsill. It sat exactly where she had left it, laces tight, ready. She moved to the wash basin and cleaned the dirt and sap from her hands, then changed into her spare shirt and braided her hair fresh. When she came down to the kitchen, Idris had set the table for 2, and they ate together in comfortable silence, passing bread and butter and a stew thick with vegetables from the garden behind the house. "There is a market in town on 6th Day," Idris said as he cleared the plates. "I will be taking a load of early apples and some cider from last season. You are welcome to come if you want to see the town, or you can stay here and rest. Either way is fine." "I will stay," Wren said quickly. Towns meant people, and people meant stares and whispers and sometimes worse. Idris nodded as if he had expected the answer. "Suit yourself. There is cold chicken in the larder if you get hungry, and the orchard is yours to walk if you like." That night Wren checked the boot and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through the eaves. She thought about the offer to stay through spring and felt the old familiar fear rise up to meet it, the certainty that kindness was only a loan that would be called due when she least expected it. She fell asleep with her hand curled near the edge of the cot, ready to move fast if needed. The days folded into a pattern, each one measured by the work of the orchard and the slow turn of the season. Wren picked apples and hauled crates and learned the particular needs of each section of trees, and Idris worked beside her with a quiet competence that never tipped into scrutiny. He did not hover or correct unless she asked for guidance, and he did not comment when she kept to her room in the evenings instead of lingering in the kitchen. On sixth day, he drove the wagon to town and returned with supplies and payment from the market vendors, and he always left her share of the wages on the kitchen table in a small cloth pouch. No ceremony or expectation attached. By the time autumn began to deepen, and the leaves turned gold and crimson, Wren had been at the orchard for 2 months. The work had shifted from picking to pressing, the cider house running from dawn to dusk as they processed the fruit into barrels of juice that would ferment slowly through the winter. It was hot work, feeding apples into the press and hauling the heavy barrels into the cellar, and by the end of each day, Wren was too tired to do more than eat and fall into bed. It was on one of those evenings, when the light was fading fast and the air smelled of crushed apples and yeast, that Wren noticed the building beyond the barn. It was small and set back from the main cluster of structures, half hidden by a stand of young pines, and in all her time at the orchard she had not seen Idris go near it. The door was weathered and hung slightly crooked, and the windows were dark with dust. Curiosity pulled at her as she walked back to the house, but she pushed it aside. It was not her place to pry into Idris's business. The next morning she asked anyway, standing in the kitchen while Idris poured coffee and the autumn sun slanted through the windows. "What is the building past the barn? The one with the pines around it?" Idris's hand stilled on the coffee pot for just a moment, then he set it down and turned to look at her. His expression was carefully neutral, the same calm mask he wore when dealing with difficult customers at the market. "That was my brother's workshop. He was a carpenter, made furniture and cabinets, that sort of thing." "Was," Wren said, and immediately regretted the question. "He died 6 years ago, a fall from a ladder while he was working on a roof repair." Idris picked up his coffee and took a long drink, his gaze fixed on the window. "I have not been in there since." Wren felt the weight of the silence that followed and knew better than to press further. She nodded and turned her attention to her own breakfast. But the image of the abandoned workshop stayed with her through the day, a puzzle piece that did not quite fit the picture of the careful, steady man who ran the orchard. She had thought him simply private, content in his solitude, but now she recognized the shape of something else, a grief that had settled into the foundation of his life and changed the way he moved through the world. That night she checked the boot and found herself thinking about the workshop, about the weight of leaving a place unfinished. She had never stayed anywhere long enough to leave something behind, never planted roots deep enough to require mourning when they were torn up. The boot on the windowsill was proof of that, a monument to her refusal to be caught unaware. But something about the image of that closed door, that space full of dust and abandoned projects, made her chest ache in a way she did not have words for. The days grew shorter and colder as autumn slid toward winter, and the work in the orchard shifted to maintenance and preparation. Wren helped Idris prune the trees and repair fences and stack firewood against the coming snows, and in the evenings they fell into a routine of shared meals and quiet companionship. Idris was not a talkative man, but he had a dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally, and Wren found herself relaxing in small increments, her shoulders loosening, her sleep coming easier. It was in late autumn, when frost began to silver the grass each morning, that Wren realized she had stopped checking the boot every night. The habit had faded so gradually she had not noticed its absence until she was already in bed one evening, the blanket pulled up and her body settling into sleep, and she realized she had not even glanced at the windowsill. She sat up, heart suddenly pounding, and stared at the boot in the darkness. It sat where it always did, laces tight, ready. But for the first time since she had arrived, it felt less like a lifeline and more like a relic, something left over from a version of herself she was starting to outgrow. The realization frightened her more than comfort had any right to. She lay back down and pulled the blanket over her head, trying to ignore the way her hands shook. Trust was dangerous. Trust was the thing that got you hurt when the people you relied on decided you were not worth the trouble. She had learned that lesson a dozen times over, and she would not forget it now just because Idris Zane was kind and the orchard was peaceful, and the work made her feel useful. She would not. But the next morning, when she came down to the kitchen, and Idris greeted her with coffee and a question about whether she wanted eggs or oatmeal, she felt something crack open in her chest, small and fragile and terrifying. She took the coffee and sat at the table and said, "Eggs, please." And when Idris smiled at her, she felt the foundation of her careful defenses shift. Winter arrived in earnest in early December, snow falling thick and soft over the valley and muffling the world in white. The work slowed to a fraction of its autumn pace, and Wren spent her days helping Idris with indoor tasks, repairing tools and organizing the storage cellar, and mending the harnesses for the plow horses. The evenings grew longer, and sometimes Idris would pull out a deck of cards and they would play simple games by the fire, not talking much but content in the warmth and the flicker of the flames. It was during one of those evenings, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled on the hearth, that Wren asked, "What did your brother make? In his workshop, I mean." Idris looked up from his cards, surprise flickering across his face, and then he set them down and leaned back in his chair. Tables mostly, chairs. He had a commission for a set of cabinets when he died, never finished them. He was good at it, better than I ever was. He could look at a piece of wood and see what it wanted to be. "You still have his tools?" Wren asked. "Everything is still there." "I locked it up after the funeral and never went back." Idris's voice was quiet, steady, but there was something beneath it, a current of old pain that had never quite healed. "I kept meaning to clear it out, sell the tools or give them to someone who would use them, but I never did." Wren thought about that, about the weight of a space left untouched, and then she said, "Maybe you do not need to clear it out. Maybe you just need to open it." Idris looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable, and then he picked up his cards again and said, "Maybe." They did not speak of it again that night, but the next morning Wren woke to find Idris standing in the yard with a key in his hand, staring at the workshop. She watched from her window as he crossed the snow-covered ground and unlocked the door, pushing it open and stepping inside. He was in there for a long time, long enough that Wren dressed and made her way down to the kitchen and started coffee. And when he finally returned, his face was drawn, but his shoulders were straighter than she had seen them before. "I found the cabinets," he said, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "They are half finished. The wood is still good." Wren poured him a cup of coffee and handed it over. "Will you finish them?" "I do not know if I can. I am not a carpenter." He took the coffee and wrapped his hands around the cup, warming them. "But maybe I could try." Over the weeks that followed, Idris began spending his afternoons in the workshop. Wren did not intrude, but she watched him come and go, saw the sawdust on his trousers and the thoughtful expression on his face when he returned to the house for meals. He did not talk about what he was working on, and she did not ask, but there was a change in him, subtle but unmistakable, a sense of purpose that had been missing before. Winter settled into its deepest cold, and the orchard slept beneath the snow. Wren and Idris fell into a rhythm that felt less like employer and worker, and more like partnership, each of them tending to the tasks that kept the farm running and the animals fed. On the coldest nights they sat by the fire and talked, carefully at first and then with more ease, sharing stories that did not dig too deep, but revealed enough to build a foundation of understanding. Idris told her about growing up in the valley, about learning the orchard from his father, and taking it over when the old man retired to the coast. Wren told him about the places she had worked, the rhythm of harvest seasons and the satisfaction of work well done. And if she left out the reasons she never stayed longer than a season, he did not press. It was in late winter, when the days were beginning to lengthen, and the snow was still thick on the ground, that Wren walked out to the workshop one afternoon and found the door ajar. She hesitated, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The space was warmer than she expected, heated by a small stove in the corner, and the air smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil. The cabinets stood against the far wall, nearly complete, their surfaces smooth and gleaming in the winter light. Idris was bent over a piece of trim, planing it with careful strokes, and he looked up when she entered. "They are beautiful," Wren said, moving closer to examine the cabinets. The wood was honey-colored and rich with grain, the joints fitted so perfectly she could barely see the seams. "They will be when they are done." Idris set down the plane and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Another week, maybe two. I am slower than my brother was, but you are finishing them." Wren ran her fingers over the smooth surface of one cabinet door, feeling the care that had gone into every detail. "That matters." Idris looked at her, something unspoken passing between them, and then he nodded. "It does. Thank you for pushing me to open this place." "I did not realize how much I needed to." Wren felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I only suggested it. You did more than that." Idris picked up the plane again, turning it over in his hands. "You reminded me that leaving things unfinished does not honor the people we lose. It just traps us with them." They stood in the workshop together as the afternoon light faded, and Wren felt something shift in her chest, the knot that had lived there for so long loosening just a fraction. She thought about the boot on her windowsill, about the reflex to keep ready to run, and she wondered for the first time if maybe, just maybe, she could let herself stay. Spring arrived slowly, creeping in with warmer winds and the first green shoots pushing through the melting snow. The orchard began to wake, buds swelling on the branches, and Idris and Wren turned their attention to the work of a new season. They pruned and fertilized and repaired the winter damage to fences and trellises. And as the days grew longer and warmer, Wren found herself smiling more, laughing at Idris's dry observations and teasing him when he got too serious about the perfect angle for a pruning cut. It was in early spring, nearly a year after Wren had first arrived, that the trouble began. Idris came back from town one sixth day with his face set in grim lines and a letter clutched in his hand. He did not speak through dinner, and when Wren finally asked what was wrong, he handed her the letter without a word. It was from a debt collection agency, informing Idris that the loan his father had taken out to expand the orchard years ago was being called due. The bank had sold the debt to a private buyer, and the new holder was demanding payment in full within 60 days, or they would foreclose on the property. The amount was staggering, far more than Idris could raise in 2 months, even if the harvest was good. "This cannot be legal," Wren said, reading through the letter a second time. "They cannot just demand payment like this. They can if the terms allow it, and apparently they do. Idris took the letter back and folded it with shaking hands. My father refinanced during a bad year, took whatever terms he could get to keep the orchard running. I thought I had paid it down enough that it would not matter, but I was wrong. Wren felt the old familiar fear stir in her gut, the instinct to cut and run before the collapse caught her. If the orchard was lost, her position would go with it, and she would be back on the road looking for work in a world that did not trust orcs. The smart thing would be to leave now, before she was tangled up in Idris's disaster. The smart thing would be to pack her bag and walk away while she still had the choice. But when she opened her mouth to make an excuse, to say she understood if he needed to let her go early, what came out instead was, "What can we do to fight this?" Idris looked up, surprise clear on his face. "You want to stay? I want to help if I can." Wren heard the words and felt the truth of them, fragile and new and terrifying. "You gave me a place when I needed one. Let me give you what I can in return." Something softened in Idris's expression, a crack in the wall of worry and fear. "I do not know if there is anything we can do. I need to talk to a lawyer, see if there are options. But even if we can delay the payment, I will need a very good harvest to cover it, and there is no guaranteeing the weather will cooperate." "Then we will work to make sure the harvest is as good as it can be," Wren said. "And we will figure out the rest as it comes." Over the days that followed, Idris met with a lawyer in town and came back with slightly better news. The debt could not be dismissed, but it could be restructured if he made a significant payment upfront and agreed to a higher interest rate. The amount he needed to raise by the end of summer was still daunting, but it was possible, just barely, if everything went right. He would need to sell every apple, every barrel of cider, every scrap of value the orchard could produce, and even then it would be close. Wren threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised her. She woke before dawn and worked past dusk, tending the trees with a care that bordered on obsessive, watching for signs of disease or pests, hand-pollinating the blossoms when the bees were slow. Idris worked beside her, his face drawn with worry but his hands steady, and together they coaxed the orchard into the fullest bloom Wren had seen since her arrival. But as spring turned to summer and the fruit began to set, the weather turned against them. A late frost killed a portion of the blossoms, and a dry spell in early summer stunted the growth of the surviving fruit. Idris checked the trees daily, counting the apples and calculating yields, and each time he returned to the house his expression was a little more grim. "We are going to be short," he said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his ledger open and his head in his hands. "Even if every apple makes it to market, we will not have enough to cover the payment." Wren looked at the numbers and felt the fear rise up again, sharp and insistent. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the inevitable collapse that justified all her careful preparations. The boot was still on the windowsill, laces tight, ready. She could leave tonight, walk to the nearest town and find new work before Idris's situation became her own. It would be easy. It would be smart. But when she looked at Idris, at the exhaustion and fear etched into his face, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt anger, bright and hot, at the debt buyers who preyed on struggling farmers, at the weather that refused to cooperate, at the whole unfair mess of a world that punished people for trying to hold on to what they loved. And beneath the anger, deeper and more surprising, she felt love. Not the desperate, fragile thing she had guarded against for so long, but something solid and fierce, rooted in a year of shared work and quiet evenings and the slow, tentative trust they had built together. "We are not done yet," Wren said, her voice steady. "There are still 2 months before the payment is due. A lot can change in 2 months." Idris looked at her, something like hope flickering in his eyes. "You really mean to stay, don't you? Even if this all falls apart." "I mean to stay and make sure it does not fall apart." Wren reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses and the warmth of his skin. "We will find a way." They worked through the summer with a singular focus, doing everything they could to maximize the harvest. Wren suggested reaching out to other farmers in the valley, offering to buy their surplus fruit at a fair price and process it into cider to sell under Idris's label. It was a risk, cutting into their already thin margins, but it would increase their volume and give them more product to sell. Idris agreed, and they spent a week traveling to neighboring farms, negotiating prices and arranging deliveries. The gamble paid off. By late summer, the cider house was running at full capacity, processing not just their own apples but fruit from 3 other farms, and the cellar was packed with barrels ready for market. Wren worked the press until her arms ached and her hands were stained brown with juice, and Idris hauled barrels and kept the books and drove to town twice a week to sell their goods. It was brutal, exhausting work, but for the first time since the letter arrived, the numbers in the ledger began to look less hopeless. It was in the middle of August, with the final harvest in full swing, that disaster struck. A summer storm rolled through the valley with unexpected violence, hail pounding the orchard and stripping fruit from the trees. Wren and Idris worked through the storm to cover what they could, draping tarps over the most vulnerable sections and hauling damaged fruit to the cider house before it could rot. But by the time the storm passed, a quarter of their remaining crop was destroyed. Idris stood in the orchard afterward, staring at the ruined trees with his shoulders slumped and his face pale. "That is it," he said quietly. "We cannot recover from this. The payment is due in 3 weeks and we will not have enough." Wren looked at the devastation around them and felt her heart clench, but she did not let the despair take hold. "We have 3 weeks. That is still time." "Time for what? Another miracle." Idris's voice was bitter, edged with the kind of hopelessness that came from fighting too long without winning. "I appreciate everything you have done, Wren, I truly do, but I think we need to accept that this is over." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, and Idris turned to look at her, surprise cutting through the despair. "No," Wren said again, softer but no less firm. "I have run from every hard thing in my life, Idris. I have left jobs and homes and people because I was afraid of what would happen if I stayed and things went wrong. But I am not running this time. We are going to figure this out." "How?" Idris asked, and there was something raw in his voice, something that sounded like it wanted to believe. "I do not know yet, but we will." Wren took his hand and held it tight, anchoring him. "Trust me, please." They stood together in the ruined orchard as the sun broke through the clouds, and slowly Idris nodded. "All right, we will try." Over the next week, Wren threw herself at the problem with a determination that bordered on frenzy. She calculated and recalculated their remaining inventory, reached out to merchants in neighboring towns to negotiate better prices, even considered taking out a loan of her own to cover the shortfall, though she had no collateral to offer. Nothing seemed sufficient, and as the days ticked down toward the payment deadline, she felt the fear creeping back in, whispering that she should have left when she had the chance. It was Idris who found the solution in the end. He came back from town one evening with a cautious smile on his face and a contract in his hand. "There is a merchant in the city who wants to buy the cabinets," he said, setting the contract on the table. "The ones my brother started. He saw them when he visited the workshop last week, and he is willing to pay a premium for them. It is enough to cover the gap." Wren stared at the contract, relief and surprise warring in her chest. "You are selling them?" "I am." Idris sat down across from her, his expression calm. My brother made them to be used, not to sit in a locked workshop collecting dust, and if selling them saves the orchard, I think he would be glad of it. Are you sure? Wren asked, because she knew what those cabinets meant to him, the weight of grief and memory they carried. I am sure. Idris reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. You taught me that holding on to the past does not honor it. Finishing the work and letting it go into the world, that is what honors it, and I am ready to do that. They signed the contract and delivered the cabinets, and when the payment came through it was enough, just barely, to meet the deadline and restructure the debt. The orchard was saved, and the relief was so overwhelming that Wren felt dizzy with it, the weight she had been carrying for months finally lifting. That night, after the final payment had been made and the contract signed and the crisis officially over, Wren climbed the stairs to her room and stood in front of the window. The boot sat on the sill where it always had, laces tight, ready for flight. She looked at it for a long moment, feeling the pull of old habits, the instinct to keep that escape route open just in case. But she thought about the year she had spent here, the work and the trust, and the slow, careful building of something that felt like home, and she knew with a certainty that surprised her that she did not need the boot anymore. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and carried it to the trunk at the foot of her bed. She opened the lid and set the boot inside, nestling it among the spare clothes and the few personal items she owned. Then she closed the trunk, the latch clicking shut with a finality that felt right, and she turned back to the window. The sill was bare now, empty except for the dust outline where the boot had sat for a year. She thought about leaving it that way, a monument to the fear she was setting aside, but then she smiled and went downstairs to find a lamp. When she returned and set the lamp on the windowsill, its warm light spilling out over the orchard, it felt like a declaration. Not of victory, exactly, but of choice. She had chosen to stay, and she would keep choosing it, for as long as Idris and the orchard and the life they were building together would have her. She found Idris in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a look of exhausted contentment on his face. He glanced up when she entered and smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him in weeks. "We did it," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "We did," Wren agreed, and she sat down across from him, her heart full in a way she had never quite felt before. "I want you to stay," Idris said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not just for the next season, but for as long as you want. As a partner, if you are willing. I cannot pay you much more than I already am, but the orchard is half yours in every way that matters, and I would like to make that official." Wren felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "You want me as a partner? I want you here. I want to keep working with you and building this place and figuring out how to make it through whatever comes next." Idris reached across the table and took her hand, his touch gentle. "And if I am being honest, I want more than that. I have been falling in love with you for months, Wren, and I would very much like to see where that goes if you are interested." The tears spilled over and Wren laughed, the sound shaky and bright. "I am interested," she said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I am very interested." Idris smiled, wide and unguarded, and he stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Wren wrapped her arms around him and let herself feel it, the safety and the warmth and the wild, impossible hope that maybe this time, finally, she had found a place worth staying for. They stood together in the kitchen as the night deepened outside, and when they finally pulled apart, Idris cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and sweet and full of promise. Wren kissed him back, her heart pounding, and when they broke apart she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I unpacked the boot." Idris pulled back to look at her, confusion and curiosity in his eyes. "What boot?" "The one I kept by the window, in case I needed to run." Wren smiled, feeling the weight of the confession and the lightness of being free of it. "I put it away tonight. I do not need it anymore." Understanding dawned on Idris's face, and he pulled her close again, his arms tight around her. "You are staying." "I am staying," Wren said, and this time the words were not a question or a tentative offer, but a vow. The autumn came on strong and beautiful, the orchard heavy with fruit and the air crisp with the promise of a good harvest. Wren and Idris worked side by side, picking apples and running the cider press and planning for the future. And in the evenings they sat together by the fire and talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimacy that came from trust, hard-won and freely given. It was in late autumn, when the leaves were falling and the first frost was near, that Idris took Wren back to the workshop. The space had been cleared out, the cabinets sold and the tools organized, but he had set up a new workbench in the corner and laid out plans for a project he wanted to start. "I thought we could build a new table for the kitchen," he said, unrolling the plans and spreading them across the bench. "Something big enough for a family if we ever have one. I would like to make it together, if you are willing to learn." Wren looked at the plans, at the careful measurements and the vision of something built to last, and she felt her heart swell. "I would like that." They worked on the table through the winter, learning together the rhythm of measuring and cutting and sanding, and by the time spring arrived again the table stood finished in the kitchen, solid and beautiful and theirs. It was the first thing they had built together from nothing, and it felt like a foundation, a promise of more to come. The years folded into each other after that, measured by harvests and storms and the slow, steady growth of the orchard. Wren and Idris became known in the valley as a pair, the orc woman and the human man who ran the best cider operation in the region. And if some people whispered about the strangeness of their partnership, most simply shrugged and admitted that the cider was worth any amount of gossip. They married in the spring of their third year together, a simple ceremony in the orchard with a handful of neighbors as witnesses, and Wren wore a dress the color of apple blossoms and felt more beautiful than she ever had in her life. Idris cried when he said his vows, and Wren held his hands and promised to stay, to build, to love him through whatever came, and she meant every word. Their first child, a daughter they named Alara, was born in the winter of their fourth year, and she had Wren's green skin and Idris's dark eyes and a laugh that filled the house with joy. They built a cradle from the wood of a fallen apple tree, and Wren rocked her daughter to sleep each night and marveled at the miracle of a life built not on running, but on staying. Alara was followed by a second daughter, Giselle, 2 years later, and then a third, Willa, 2 years after that. The house filled with noise and laughter and the chaos of children, and the orchard thrived under the care of a family that loved it. Wren taught her daughters to pick apples and press cider and care for the trees, and Idris taught them to build things with their hands and to honor the past by creating a future worth living. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was still, Wren and Idris would sit together at the table they had built and talk about the years behind them and the years ahead. Sometimes Wren would think about the boot, packed away in the trunk and long since forgotten, and she would feel a distant echo of the fear that had once ruled her life. But it was only an echo, faint and far away, drowned out by the fullness of the life she had chosen. The orchard grew and the family grew, and the seasons turned in their endless rhythm, and Wren Hollis, who had once kept one boot by the window to flee, found that she had built a home worth staying in forever. The windowsill that had once held a symbol of fear now held a lamp that burned every night, a beacon of warmth and welcome. And when travelers passed by and saw the light, they knew they were looking at a house where love had taken root and refused to let go. Years later, when Alara was old enough to ask about her mother's life before the orchard, Wren took her up to the small room above the cider house, now used for storage, and showed her the trunk at the foot of the old cot. She opened it and pulled out the boot, worn and cracked with age, and held it in her hands. "I kept this by the window for a whole year," Wren said, running her thumb over the cracked leather. "I was so afraid that your father would turn on me, that this place would fall apart, that I would need to run, so I kept it ready just in case." Alara looked at the boot with wide eyes. "But you did not run." "No," Wren said, smiling. "I did not. I stayed, and I unpacked it, and I built a life here with your father, and it was the best choice I ever made." She handed the boot to her daughter, letting her feel the weight of it, and then she took it back and placed it in the trunk again, closing the lid. "That is where it belongs now. A reminder of what I left behind so I could find what I needed." Alara nodded, solemn and thoughtful, and then she took her mother's hand and they went back downstairs together, leaving the boot in the darkness where it could rest, its purpose long since fulfilled. The orchard continued to thrive, season after season, and the family that tended it grew in love and strength. Wren Hollis, who had once been a girl with one boot always ready by the window, became a woman who planted roots so deep that nothing could tear them up. And she lived the rest of her days surrounded by the people she loved and the land she had chosen, free at last from the fear that had once defined her. And on quiet nights, when the lamp burned in the window and the house was warm with the sounds of family, Idris would take Wren's hand and they would stand together looking out over the orchard, and they would remember the year it took for her to unpack that boot, and they would be grateful, endlessly grateful, for the life they had built in the time since. The trunk remained in the small room, closed and undisturbed, and the boot inside it gathered dust in the peaceful darkness, a relic of a past that no longer held any power, a symbol of fear transformed by love into something that could finally, mercifully, be laid to rest.